Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's broadcast editor, bringing the show to you on Thursday, 14th of July. On the show this week, Tory MPs are fighting for the keys to number 10. Who's winning? I'll speak to James Forsyth and Katy Balls. Former Cabinet Minister Liam Fox is back in the frontrunner, Rishi Sunak. He joins the show to tell us why. After calling Saudi Arabia a pariah, Joe Biden's meeting Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to ask him to pump more oil. Will MBS do it? Paul Wood and Mary Kissel will be on the show. And finally, is it inevitable that humans will leave Earth and start life among the stars? I'll speak to the astronomer Martin Rees. A Spectator subscription is now better value than ever before. As a new subscriber joining today, you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. To subscribe, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And why not subscribe to our YouTube channel? Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. It's only been a week since the Prime Minister resigned and the Tory leadership contest has already turned into blue murder, as Fraser Nelson writes in this week's cover article. It's a fast-moving story, but here to give us the latest, I'm joined by our political editor James Forsyth and our deputy political editor Katy Balls. Katy and James, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, we're recording this on Thursday morning. Katy, what is the situation like at the moment?
So I can say what the situation is, but of course things are moving very fast when it comes to this Tory leadership contest because we have breakneck speed parliamentary round. So at the time of speaking, we've had the first ballot, we have the second ballot later today. But I think if you take a step back, effectively, I think Rishi Sunak is still the front runner, but actually the person who seems to have the most momentum behind them is Penny Mordaunt. When it came to the first ballot, you had a situation where Penny Mordaunt was in second place, not that far behind Rishi Sunak. And now I think there's a big question as to, can she overtake? Is this the person to beat? Because all the membership polling is suggesting Penny Mordaunt would do well in any run-up if she makes the final two, beating, I think, all the candidates. The other candidate who's stoking some excitement is Penny Mordaunt, and therefore you're starting to see a situation where the fresh faces, those who are less associated with Boris Johnson's government, who haven't served in senior roles in his cabinet, seem to be the ones that are generating the most buzz amongst the membership. And therefore, there's a question as to, do Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, who are still seen as two serious contenders for the final two, do they start to look too establishment? Could we have a bit of an upset on our hands when it comes to who goes to the membership?
James, is this telling us something about what the membership wants, in that they want something fresh from, not associated with the Conservative government under Boris Johnson? Penny Mordaunt and Penny Mordaunt were both junior ministers rather than cabinet ministers, as Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak have been. And we've seen polls this week that show that actually, as Katy says, Kemi and Penny would do much better with the members than Liz or Rishi.
So I think the fundamental Tory problem is that in 2019, they won this big majority on the basis of basically two things: getting Brexit done and beating Jeremy Corbyn. And both of those were achieved by the result itself, almost. And since then, the prospectus has been very uncertain. It's not been, and in some ways, COVID disguised that, because for 2 years, as almost, the government was firefighting. But now we've come out of COVID, and the need for a new agenda is all the more pressing, because you've got to get the economy moving, you've got to deal with all these backlogs in public services. And I think that sense that there isn't a clear agenda at the moment is why those who didn't hold high office in this government, like Penny Mordaunt and Penny Mordaunt, are getting the attention that they are. And I think this is the challenge here. And we wait to see how the rest of this contest pans out. And I think now the question is, Penny Mordaunt, has dramatically moved up the rankings in this race, and she's now going to come under scrutiny. You've seen, and the question is, how does she cope with that? I asked one very wise former Tory MP this morning. I said, "What do you think happens next?" And they said, "It depends how the HMS Mordaunt, as they put it, copes with the kind of incoming that it got from, say, David Frost this morning."
Well, Katie, just on Penny Mordaunt, we're going into the weekend and there's going to be a few rounds of TV debates. Is that the moment to watch for some of these relatively unknown candidates, not just Penny Mordaunt, but also Tom Tugendhat, to make themselves known to the public, known to the members? And is that where they could be falling as well?
Yeah, it's a big opportunity. It's also a big risk. Effectively, it's been interesting looking at the visibility of the candidates. So there was some interesting polling out which suggested when it comes to the general public, a really small percentage would be able to recognise Penny Mordaunt if you showed a photo and say who that was. And even amongst the Tory voters, I think it's still below 20%. And that suggests that you're in a situation where there's lots of buzz around a person, but they could fall apart quite quickly. James mentioned the David Frost criticism. That is, of course, that David Frost was suggesting that Penny Mordaunt was, not very capable when it came to negotiating on Brexit, and he didn't know where she was most of the time, and eventually he actually asked to have her moved because he found that unhelpful. So I think the fact that Penny Mordaunt's surging ahead does mean you're going to start to hear more attacks. But as you say, I think in those debates, the thing about Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak is, while they can obviously increase their visibility still, I think lots of people have already made up their minds about them. They have a perception of who they think they are. And therefore, with those lesser known candidates, so Penny Mordaunt, Kemi Badenoch and Tom Tugendhat, this is a chance for them to land an impression on the nation. But if they have a bad interview, if they don't look as though they're on top of policy details, they could start to fall quite quickly as well. So I think it's going to be quite a high pressure weekend. And particularly with someone like Penny Mordaunt, we haven't seen that much of her. She hasn't done loads of media. Even in her campaign video, it was largely pictures of other people. Some of whom didn't want their picture in it, so the video had to be taken down and amended. And she was only at the very, very end speaking. So as you get the candidates out more, I think things could change.
James, let's talk about that negative briefing that you both have alluded to. It has been a really, really vicious fight so far. Do you think this is extraordinary for a leadership contest that you've seen? And also, why do you think it's happening like that?
So, yeah, I mean, there has been a kind of demolition derby element of all this. And I think what's quite striking about the Lord Frost attack on Penny Mordaunt this morning is how Simon Clarke, who's one of Liz Truss's big cabinet backers, immediately retweeted a journalist talking about the Frost attack. There's no attempt, and Frost is I think expected to come out for the Truss camp later today. And this obviously follows days in which you've had Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg trying to take a baseball bat to Rishi Sunak, and I think the challenge for the Tories is, how unpleasant does this get? Leadership contests can work one of two ways for a party. Either they dominate the news, and that makes it quite hard for anybody else to get get any attention, get any traction, and parties can actually do well in a leadership contest. Or a leadership contest just looks a party looking very divided to the voters. And I think at the moment the risk of the Tories is that it's on the latter stage of things. Although someone did make an interesting observation to me that when they go to the final two, sometimes strange things happen between the final two candidates. So, for example, in 2005, no one would have described David Davis and David Cameron as kind of bosom buddies when they went into that final two. But touring the country, doing all those events together, they did kind of find a modus vivendi with each other. And so I think there's, maybe if one was being optimistic for the Tories, there's a chance that happens between the final two. But what is certainly true is that you can't walk down the colonnade in Parliament without someone stopping you to say something disobliging about one of the candidates.
Katie, in his cover article for the magazine this week, Spectator editor Fraser Nelson is pretty disparaging about this kind of negative campaigning, pointing out that none of them have any positive ideas. What do you make of that? Is that harmful for the Conservative Party in the medium term, as James says? And do you think, is it because they're running out of ideas that no one's saying anything positive about themselves?
I think all leadership contests become quite toxic at some point. I think you can say in this one it's become toxic very quickly. But that's partly because there's so much poison in the party. Effectively, there is still a decent chunk of MPs who don't think Boris Johnson should have had to resign. They blame figures such as Sajid Javid, who's already been knocked out, pointing out perhaps there is something in, he who wields the knife doesn't get to wear the crown. And also Rishi Sunak. And I think the level of venom towards Rishi Sunak by some Johnson loyalists is really adding to this. I think there is definitely a sense of anyone but Rishi amongst some MPs. You can see that in some of the backers to the Liz Truss campaign and also the framing of the Liz Truss campaign. So yes, talking about the economy, but also saying, I am the only candidate who can take on Rishi Sunak. And I think the fact they think that is a convincing message shows you the two criticisms against Rishi Sunak, one of which is he was not sufficiently supportive of Boris Johnson. There's a betrayal narrative some figures, Nadine Dorries, Jacob Rees-Mogg, are really trying to push. And then, of course, those who oppose him on fiscal policy. So I think the nature of how this leadership contest came about, it didn't come about because there was an election defeat and there is, in a way, this big battle of ideas. Now, there's still a battle of ideas going on, but it came about because of personality, problems with Boris Johnson, an attempt to force him out. And it just does mean you're in this landscape where things are pretty febrile. And obviously we use that word a lot in Westminster, but I think that is why it can at times feel, dark ops, blue on blue. And the fact that now you have, can people such as David Frost going after Penny Mordaunt, as well as people like Nadine Dorries going after Rishi Sunak, just shows that I think this is going to get more vicious before it gets calmer. And depending on who is in the final two, it could be a very, very bruising summer for the Tory party.
Katie, just on that, you interviewed Liz Truss for this week's magazine. What did she say that jumped out at you? What were her ideas? Did anything surprise you?
Well, I think ultimately Liz Truss is one of several candidates in this leadership contest who is pledging to cut tax, and specifically in the case of Liz Truss to reverse national insurance. I think that's something she's suggesting she would do on day one in terms of that hike, and also looking at corporation tax. And she is saying how she will fund that, which not all the candidates have done. And that is to treat COVID debt like wartime debt, take a longer time to push it back. Ultimately, she's going for economic growth, but the implication is, if needed to, she will borrow to fund tax cuts. So I think the level of honesty there, and actually not just talking about cutting taxes, lots of people have done, but offering a bit of some flavour of how you're really going to achieve that, is something her camp are hoping will show that she is more of a serious contender than some of the others, in the sense that she has experience. She would actually deliver on the things she is saying, when you have figures in the Rishi camp who want to suggest lots of these things are pie in the sky or irresponsible. I also found it quite interesting talking to Liz Truss. The interviews in two stages. Began in France when Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister, and then, of course, had to be updated given the current situation. But there is a nickname for Liz Truss, which first aired in The Spectator several years ago, of the human hand grenade. Now, this is alleged to have come from Dominic Cummings, who at the time was with Michael Gove, and the idea was that wherever she goes, things would blow up. So I think, at least for some, it was not meant as a compliment.
Right.
So I asked Liz Truss, how do you feel about this nickname, which these days is hurled at you in an insulting way? I think Dominic Cummings tweets it semi-regularly. And she said she took it effectively as a backhanded compliment, and it showed that she gets things done. So I thought, trying to turn a criticism into an advantage and feed it back to that delivery line.
And James, in your political column this week, you write about a fundamental thing that all of these candidates will have to prove that they can do, which is to renew the Conservative Party. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the hardest thing for any political party to achieve is renewal in office. And the Tories have done it twice. In 2016, they changed leader and tack in response to changing circumstances, the Brexit referendum. And in 2019, they did the same thing, albeit more successfully, again, because of Brexit. And I think in both 2016 and 2019, it was clear that Brexit was the thing that the Tory party needed to shift on to win again. I think it is less clear now what the issue is that the Tories need to shift on to win again. I suspect ultimately the biggest challenge for them is to get the economy growing again. Why are the choices so hard in British politics right now? Because in the 30 years before the financial crash, productivity grew over 2% a year. In the time since 2008, productivity has grown about 0.4% a year. And that is one of the things that is making things so hard. I think there is also a big question, which is the Tories have to show that they can govern competently. I think this is one of the big challenges for whoever succeeds Boris Johnson, is to show that the kind of government is delivering and getting things done, and that it has because I think there is a dangerous narrative taking hold in the country. But this is a country where you struggle to get a GP appointment, where NHS waiting lists are still going up. They've got to be able to show but they can reform public services so that they deliver for people.
And Katie, just finally, by the time viewers are watching this, another round of the leadership contest will have happened. One more candidate will be out, taking us down to 5. But from Friday onwards, Katie, what are we going to be looking out for? What are the key moments in the contest?
So after Thursday's round, which will have happened by the time you're watching this, there'll be a situation by which there'll be a slight lull over the weekend in terms of no more ballots. There's not one on Friday. So it kicks off again on Monday. And that means the candidates have Friday night and the weekend for several TV debates, and also to set out their stall ahead of the knockout rounds next week. And we would expect, and the plan is, according to the 22 committee, to have the final 2 candidates by next week. And therefore we will know who is going to the membership and settling down for a long campaigning summer of various hustings.
Katie and James, thanks very much. Now, for viewers who want more up-to-date political analysis, maybe even daily or twice daily, we've got a very regular podcast. It's called Coffee House Shots. You can get it for free wherever you get your podcasts from. And it features Katy Balls, James Forsyth, Fraser Nelson, and sometimes I'm on there too, talking about the twists and turns of every single moment of Westminster politics. So that's where you get the daily update from. Now let's talk to one of the senior Tories with a horse in the race. Former Cabinet Minister Liam Fox says that he is #ready for Rishi. He joins me now. Liam Fox, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, to start with, tell us why you're backing Rishi Sunak.
Well, I think that MPs look at candidates in 2 ways. Some of them look at them tactically, who will knock out whom and who might give me a job. Others look at them, I think, very directly. I look at candidates and I think, I know what I believe in, which is the candidate closest to what I believe in all these elements. And, what I wanted to see was I wanted to see somebody who actually believed in Brexit. I wanted to see someone who believed in free markets, who believed in free trade and was definitely anti-protectionism. Someone who believes in the union, someone who believes in the strength of our relationship with the United States, and someone who understands aspiration, the value of education, and what it means to create opportunity, prosperity and hope in the country. So Rishi was the candidate, in my view, who was closest to all of those boxes. You never find a candidate who is entirely in line with all the things you think, and always it's about which one is the closest.
From all the things that you've just said, why not Liz Truss?
Because Rishi was a Brexiteer, even when he was put under enormous pressure as a newly elected MP by the Cameron administration, telling him that he wouldn't have a future if he voted for Brexit. He was in there in the trenches all the time. And I know that other candidates have had a conversion after the referendum, and it's not, I don't in any way cast aspersions on the sincerity in that, but I like to have someone who was there in the fight at the time, even when it was thought to be going to be on the losing side, and stuck by their principles all the way through. For me, that is what leadership is about.
And Liam, it's clear that you are a low-tax, small-state believer. In the past, you've called yourself an unreconstructed free market Thatcherite. But this candidate, Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, he has resided over the highest tax burden in a 75-year period. And he's just about to increase corporation tax from 19% to 25%. So how can you be so sure that he's also a fiscal conservative? What makes you think that he's going to bring tax cuts later down the line?
Well, what you described as being a fiscal conservative, it's not been willing to spend money without willing to balance the books. And this idea that you can increase spending and cut taxes at the same time results in only one thing, and that's increased borrowing. And borrowing is merely deferred taxes. If we want taxes to come down, then we have to earn tax cuts by having increased prosperity, increased growth in the economy, and control our spending. And I'm convinced that Rishi Sunak is someone who believes in a smaller state over time. Now, you could argue, yes, that he was the Chancellor who oversaw the increased spending in the pandemic, but I didn't hear many other members of the Cabinet at the time saying they were going to resign in protest. Likewise, the increased spending on the NHS and social care, about which I have different reservations. Mainly that money is not going to social care but into the NHS, and the NHS will cry foul when it has to hand that money over to social care. That's a different issue. But if we want to see more spending on the NHS, either that money has to be diverted from other programmes within a contained government spending programme, or we generate more income to pay for it, or we tax more, of course, or we borrow more, which I rule out. So, there's a view now that you can simply cut tax and that's fine, it will produce growth itself. I've never really believed in that. I think you can cut business taxes and get increased business activity. But I think that overall, you have a duty to the next generation not to borrow money and defer the taxes onto them for our spending today.
So if the state's going to get smaller under a Prime Minister Sunak, what is he going to be cut? And is that a return to austerity?
Well, I think that there's a debate that we haven't really got into in this election, which is, how is Whitehall shaped? How is the overall government run in the country? And also, what I would say, I would categorise as the difference between growth and wealth creation. And by that I mean that any dummy can spend tomorrow's money today, borrow it, and call the increased level of activity growth. I think that's very different from wealth creation, by which I mean that wealth creation is when we take our unique IP and we turn that into a good or a service that doesn't exist today, or a better good or service than exists today. And what's the problem with us at the present time? The problem with us is that we have too much IP leakage out of the country at the moment, because we have a real problem with scale-ups. We're great at developing the IP, we're great at startups, we're very innovative, we're very creative as a nation, but we're very poor at financing it. And I think one of our problems is that to genuinely create more wealth and create more prosperity, we need to be thinking much more about how we remove the supply side restrictions that stop us being able to scale up a lot more with private equity than we do today. That's a major challenge, and I'm rather disappointed that the debate has so far been, you said this, you said that, rather than setting out what I would like to see as a very constructive economic programme for the future.
And Liam, you're former International Trade Secretary. What do you make of the government's plans to extend steel tariffs for another 2 years? If there is a Prime Minister Sunak, will you expect him to be cancelling those tariffs?
Well, I would hope so. I'm appalled by it. I spent 3 years setting up the Department for International Trade based on a concept of open, outward-looking trading relations for the UK, how we would increase our exports, how we'd increase both inward and outward investment. We set up the TRA to be able to set the rules as part of our WTO, World Trade Organization, obligations. The current government passed legislation to be able to override that, which I found very hard to swallow. But then to actually apply these protections to the steel industry, which are in breach, which the government acknowledge of our international obligations, goes too far, and I said so in my letter to Boris Johnson. The danger here is that in order to protect a small bit of one industry, lots of other industries feel the full force of retaliatory measures that other countries are allowed to have. So, for example, Scotch whisky, ceramics, the bike industry could all be hit by measures that might be taken by countries like, say, South Korea. Nobody wins in a trade war, and why? After we've got Brexit, we would take Britain back to a more protectionist position than the EU that we've left. I find really difficult to swallow, and ultimately I couldn't.
And Liam, I also want to get your thoughts on Fraser Nelson's cover article in this week's Spectator, in which he talks about the dirty tricks and the black ops that happen in leadership contests. One trick is to lend votes, where one candidate lends votes to another candidate because they believe that that one will be weaker in the final face-off. Now, some actually say that this is what happened to you when you ran for leadership against David Cameron, that the Cameron campaign lent votes to David Davis's campaign because they believe that David Davis will be a weaker candidate to go against than yourself. Do you think there's any truth in that? I
think it does happen. I find it very sad that it happens. This is not a game. And even more than in opposition, we have to take our current task really seriously. We're electing a Prime Minister of the country in just a few weeks' time. They will have to take on all the responsibilities of Prime Minister, from nuclear deterrent to our other foreign policy to our domestic range of policies, from healthcare to education. They'll have to set up a cabinet. They'll need to understand how the whole government's going to move forward 2.5 years or less from an election. They'll have to deal with high inflation, not only in Britain but internationally, as well as what I regard as monetary policy that's been too lax in the UK. A whole range of issues. There's no time for learning on the job. This is about getting somebody in place who can be Prime Minister quickly, who understands how the system works at the highest level, and can put a team together. And how this relates to your question about lending votes, I think that I would judge the best candidate to be Prime Minister by those they attract to them. And we can't have somebody being the Boris candidate or the anti-Boris candidate or the anti-somebody else candidate. What we need to have is an understanding that in the Conservative Party we avoid external coalitions by maintaining an internal coalition. And what I want to see is somebody, preferably somebody from the right of the Conservative Party, where I regard Rishi as coming from. But I also want to see a broad tent. I want to see us incorporating the talents that we have within a single government programme. If we start to be not a single party, not a broad church, but a coalition of political minorities, geographical and on different parts of the political spectrum, I think we simply add strength to our opponents. So for me, do I have a candidate who reflects more closely what I believe, who can bring different parts of the party together, experienced enough to hit the ground running, and intelligent enough to deal with the different hurdles that will face us? It's not an easy package to find, and you can never find a perfect one. But for me, Rishi Sunak fits that picture better than anyone else.
Well, just finally, Liam, on that disunity that you're talking about, I have to say that the last 7 days for outside and probably inside observers of the leadership contest haven't, given us much hope of unity going forward. What do you make of Nadine Dorries and other Boris Johnson supporters' claims that Rishi Sunak's campaign has been engaging in lending votes to Jeremy Hunt's campaign and others?
Well, I've not seen any of that, I have to say. And I find leadership contests truly awful. It's hard to explain how poisonous the atmosphere can be. It ruins friendships. It damages relationships in the long term. And I actually had to send an email to someone who's a friend of mine the other day and saying, don't lose your friends over this. I've seen it all before. It's not worth it. But there's something comes across colleagues when they get into these situations. My view would be pick the candidate who reflects your views, campaign for them, and after it's all over, come back together and recognise that the real danger to conservatism doesn't come from within the Conservative Party. It lies out there from socialism and nationalism, two very toxic forces which will not only potentially damage the Conservative Party irreversibly, but much more importantly, damage our country irreversibly.
Liam Fox, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Remember, if you enjoy what we do here at The Spectator, you can subscribe to the magazine and to our online content. To subscribe today, go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. President Biden visits Saudi Arabia this week. It's an awkward trip for him, given his strong condemnation of Prince Mohammed bin Salman for the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But given the Russian invasion, America needs the Gulf state to pump more oil. That might explain why Biden squirmed when asked about the trip. Paul Wood writes about this uncomfortable position in this week's issue, and he joins me now, together with Mary Kissel, former advisor to Trump's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Paul, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, in the magazine this week, you write about Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia. Can you tell us why this trip is so important?
It's all about the price of oil. Russia is funding its war in Ukraine with oil at around $100 a barrel. And the number one priority for the US and indeed for Britain is to undercut Russia with economic sanctions by turning off the billions of dollars in hard currency they can get from oil. So they need the OPEC countries, of which Saudi Arabia is the most important, to raise oil production. Now, here's where the embarrassment factor comes in. Saudi Arabia is supposed to be a pariah, in the words of Joe Biden in his election campaign 18 months ago. But the OPEC meeting is in Saudi Arabia, and of course it's the Saudi voice which dominates OPEC. So he has to go and pay his respects, doff his cap to MBS, the man who or ordered the murder of a dissident journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, in cold blood, at least according to the CIA. It doesn't do any harm either that this would bring down prices at the pumps for Americans. $5 a barrel, record prices for Americans. People are feeling economic pain in the United States, the same as everywhere else. And of course, the wider economic relationship with Saudi Arabia is important. So all of which is to say, having a conscience is expensive, and now perhaps is not the time that the US leader thinks he can afford that.
And presumably Saudi Arabia will be asking for something in return for pumping more oil if they acquiesce at all, which, Paul, I guess they might not. But if they do, they might be asking for something in return, which is to stop talking about human rights, stop talking about Khashoggi at all.
Well, on the question of whether they can actually do anything, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was caught on camera. I thought it was a private conversation, telling President Biden, well, don't assume the Saudis can actually give you much more. But I think even 1 million barrels a day would be significant. And analysts who study this for a living are talking about 1 million barrels a day. What do the Saudis want? Well, ultimately, they want security guarantees. That's what the deal has always been for the 75 years that the US has been in business with the Saudi royal family. And security guarantees at the moment will take an interesting new form. There are these things called the Abraham Accords, negotiated by Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, a deal, a new alliance between Israel and one very important Gulf country, the United Arab Emirates, also Bahrain. It may not be that the Saudis get to officially be part of the Abraham Accords, but in all but name, there may be an alliance with Israel, which would be underwritten by American security guarantees, potentially expensive new commitments. So I think that's probably number one priority for the Saudis, but also very usefully for MBS. He's out of the penalty box. President Trump, in Trump's own words, saved his ass by not immediately pointing the finger at MBS. But then Joe Biden took a very interesting step quite early on, after he arrived in the Oval Office, of publishing the CIA assessment, which said that MBS was guilty of organising this murder. It was one of his very close associates in the royal court who did it, allegedly, a man called Saud al-Qahtani. Now, at the time when this was published, there were some sanctions against minor Saudi officials, nothing against MBS. So already then there was a recognition that MBS was not going to pay the price for this, if indeed he's guilty of it. Let's remember the Saudis deny it. But now this is kind of the public affirmation of this. And I think something of a humiliation for Biden. He looked very conflicted when he was speaking about this at the NATO summit, stumbling over his words more than might be accounted for if, as some people think about things, losing some mental function. That's always the allegation about Biden these days, including on Saudi television, by the way. A very funny sketch on Saudi TV shows Kamala Harris literally holding up Biden at the podium. But for MBS, it's all about publicly, he's out of the penalty box. And the Saudis are crowing in a press release from their embassy in Washington, D.C. about a meeting with a long list of things to be discussed one-on-one with Biden. We'll see if the president has to swallow that, if he has to shake the hand of the man that allegedly issued the death warrant for Jamal Khashoggi.
Well, that's incredible what you say about the Saudi sketch there. So they're essentially expecting something like this to have happened anyway, presumably, because, as you say, having a conscience is expensive. Even when Biden was having his tough words, they probably expected him to come back to them and actually don't respect him that much.
I mean, we're talking about relations between states in terms of personalities. And in one way, that's false because states have interests which go beyond individual personalities. But if the era of Donald Trump told us anything, it's that personalities do matter. And MBS is quite a volatile character, reminiscent of Trump in that. He's got an explosive temper, apparently. He can be extremely direct with visiting foreign leaders. And this is the crucial point. He's the crown prince now. His father, King Salman, is apparently quite ill. And if the succession goes as expected, this could be the ruler of Saudi Arabia for the next 50 years. This is the man that people have to do business with. And his personality, very volatile, matters here. And that's the man that President Biden's dealing with.
Yeah. Well, what next for Biden then, Paul? Do you think he can, not have a gaffe as he visits Saudi Arabia this week, not say something accidentally that, accuses MBS of some kind of moral flaw. I mean, is he actually going to be able to doff the cap?
Look, this is all about the mental capacity of President Biden. Now, on the one hand, this is a president who is immensely experienced in foreign affairs. He was vice president, had some very important briefs as vice president, including Afghanistan. And before that, let's not forget, as a senator, he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. Often it seemed in that role as if he knew more than some of the witnesses who appeared before that committee. So this is a man who, again, in contrast to his predecessor, knows what he is talking about and knows how to deal with foreign leaders. But apparently well-sourced stories in the US media, for instance, say that his aides are quite worried about overtaxing him. He is alleged to work only a 5-day week, and they try to ring-fence the weekend so that he is not overtaxed, so that he is not pushed too hard. They didn't schedule this Middle East trip immediately after the NATO summit. There's a time difference to deal with here. There's a journey to deal with here. How sharp is he going to be? How much will he be insulated by his aides? We simply don't know. But the underlying reality he's dealing with here is that he has to swallow his pride. He has to forget those words about Saudi Arabia being a pariah, about MBS paying the price for Jamal Khashoggi. He has to do business with the Saudis. He needs those oil taps to be opened, and that means probably a public handshake with the man that he's allowed the CIA to publicly accuse of murder.
And Paul, just before I let you go, we want to get your thoughts on one thing, which is the difficulty of balancing this conscience with realpolitik, the interests of nation states, as you mentioned them. You and I, as journalists, we're on the sidelines. We're not making these decisions, and we can see where things were going wrong in our view, or with hindsight, perhaps. But for those making the decision, I mean, it is difficult, isn't it, for a Western leader like Joe Biden, who talks about human rights, who talks about freedom, and who wants to contain a country like China or Russia from preventing them doing human rights abuses elsewhere. And then they have to sidle up with someone like Saudi Arabia. I mean, I'd see a bit of cognitive dissonance in a lot of Western voters and Western politicians in thinking, where that balance lies, because I think a lot of the time it does seem to be more about national interest with human rights as like a bit of a cloak.
Yeah, sure. It's human rights versus your own economic and security interests, and it's a problem for all Western democracies. I noticed that Liz Truss, one of the frontrunners for the job of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee a couple of weeks ago, looked very, very conflicted. She was quite artfully questioned by the chairman, Chris Bryant, and couldn't remember a single instance, or chose not to remember and talk about a single instance in which she had pressed a Gulf country about human rights. And in the end, she fell back on the formula, well, these conversations are private and it's better that they stay that way. Exactly the same formula that Boris Johnson used when he went to Saudi Arabia in March after the war in Ukraine had started, begging the Saudis to open the oil taps. And again, he was asked, what about human rights? He said, we have to keep these conversations private if they are to be effective. Look, there are risks in indulging your conscience when you're a government and a country. The last time that human rights drove American foreign policy, you could say, was in the Jimmy Carter era, when, revolted by the Shah of Iran's secret police and the repression that the Shah was using to stay in power, they backed the forces of change, and they got a regime change to a theocratic dictatorship in the form of Ayatollah Khomeini and all his successors, and all the problems of a nuclear-armed Iran, possibly, that we see today. So this is a high-risk game. And for the moment, at least, Western leaders, including President Biden, have recognized the simple fact that we do not choose the Saudi leader. We have to deal with the Saudi leader that we've got. So Liz Truss said, it is not a perfect world.
Paul Wood, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And I'm now joined by Mary Kissel. Mary was an advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo under the Trump administration. Mary, welcome to Spectator TV.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
First of all, I guess, now that you're not in the administration anymore, can you tell us, how do you rate President Biden's Middle East policy so far?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that the president really prioritized foreign policy. I think his administration came into office thinking, much like the Obama administration before him, that the project was really about remaking America. And so he adopted many of the same policies that his predecessor 2 presidents ago adopted and tried to appease the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism in the region. That's the Islamic Republic of Iran. He shunned our friends in the region, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf nations. And as a result, we saw exactly the same thing that we saw when we ran this experiment a couple of years ago, which is that as we allowed Tehran to obtain more cash, they used that to spread their malign influence around the region. And I think what you've seen is, unfortunately, an increase in their nuclear capacity, nuclear production capacity. You saw an increased relationship with other bad actors like Communist China and Russia. They're now launching rockets into the UAE. They've launched attacks on northern Iraq. And unfortunately, this is not good. It's not good for the region. It's certainly not good for US national interests. And it's not good for anybody who wants a sustainable peace in the region.
It's something that Paul and I were discussing, and he writes about in his piece, is this conflict between having a conscience, basically, and the national interests of a country like America. You know, Mary, you're talking about Iran and the need to balance Iran in the region. But America is also leader of the free world. It talks about human rights. It likes to protect human rights. And that is, in fact, one of the reasons it has a problem with countries like Russia and China, because of human rights abuses. So why does that matter less when it comes to Saudi Arabia then? Because this is a country that is pretty unsavory in many ways.
Well, there were a couple of things there that I think I'd like to correct. First, I'm not sure we are trying to balance Iran in every US administration. This administration may be trying to do that, but I think the prior administration that I served in tried to constrain Iran's terrorist activities and to forge new diplomatic ties in the region. And you saw that come to fruition in the Abraham Accords. And secondly, I don't think anyone is downplaying human rights in Saudi Arabia. It's unfortunately, it's a very difficult situation to deal with, because it's a question, if you go back to, say, Jean Kirkpatrick, right, where she talked about the different kinds of authoritarian regimes. There are those authoritarian regimes that you can talk to, you can urge to reform, that share your strategic interests, and you can kind of try to push along in the right direction. I think Saudi falls in that camp, although you have to say it has an absolutely horrific human rights record. On the other hand, you have authoritarian regimes that you can't talk to, that have no interest in reform and that want to kill you. And that's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And what do you do in that situation? It's a very difficult thing. And I also think it's very different to be kind of on the outside observing and categorizing these countries as, well, this is a quote unquote good country and this is a quote unquote bad country. That's simply not how foreign policy works in the real world. You're dealing with a situation where you have a power in the Middle East, in Tehran, that wants to obtain nuclear weapons, that is vowed to destroy Israel, that has a global, by the way, terrorist network. They've tried to kill the Saudi ambassador here in the United States not too long ago. They have a hit out on my former boss, Mike Pompeo, and our special envoy, Brian Hook. They terrorize their own people. Saudi Arabia is not attacking its neighbors. In fact, it's reached out for peace. Now, it doesn't excuse their human rights. They have made some strides on women's rights, but it's nowhere near enough. And the cold reality of the world is that, Saudi Arabia may never look like Britain or the United States. Iran may not. What we want to do is we want to create a situation where, we don't have conflict, where we secure resources that the region and the world needs, and that we try to constrain and eliminate where we can activities by nations like Iran that are upsetting that equilibrium that we want, and it's not an easy thing to do.
No, I appreciate that, and of course, as a journalist sitting from the outside, you know much more about what's happening inside the administration. I'm interested in picking up one thing that you said there, which is about the ability to reform a country like Saudi Arabia. I think that will raise a lot of eyebrows for people around watching the show, because it was only in March, before Boris Johnson visited Saudi Arabia, that they executed 81 people in a single day. We haven't really mentioned the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And there were reports as well that when Pompeo and Trump were in administration, even in private meetings, this kind of human rights abuse weren't raised. So what efforts were made to reform this country?
Well, I don't know what reports you're referring to, but I certainly know that Secretary Pompeo raised those concerns. But, it's interesting when you talk about Saudi Arabia, Iran's human rights abuses are never mentioned. And in fact, they have British hostages, US hostages. They have basically torture chambers in Evin prison. And that's never mentioned. Now, human rights is not a contest, right, for the worst offender. And it is indeed true. All of those statistics that you just mentioned about Saudi Arabia, as I said, it has a terrible record. At the same time, you've seen MBS curb the religious police. You've seen enormous outreach to Israel. You've seen rights for women in courts and other areas, women in the workplace in Saudi Arabia. There's actually quite a lot going on that I think doesn't receive an awful lot of attention. And that's a shame. And again, it's not a question of, one man and the terrible thing that happened to him. Is this a nation that wants peace? Is it a nation that we can deal with? Or is this a nation that is spreading terror around the world? I think these are two very different places. And also, too, we shouldn't look at these places in isolation. It's not a US-Saudi relationship or a British-Saudi relationship or a US-Iran relationship. These nations all talk to each other, they trade with each other, they cooperate with one another. And you have to look at it through that lens, too. Who is Saudi Arabia trying to align with? It's trying to align with the Gulf nations and the free states of the West. Who is Iran trying to align with? Communist China, Russia. In fact, Vladimir Putin is going there just this week. He wants to buy Iranian drones. These are two very different things. And I think it's a lot more complex than simply asking, what happened in a single conversation to a single man, as awful as the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was.
Fundamentally, Mary, for yourself in your foreign policy axis, do you think that it's all about alliances and the American national interest, and wherever possible and wherever needed, human rights would be taking a backseat because of national interest?
Well, again, what protects ultimately human rights, really, at the end of the day? It's a democratic system, it's a rule of law, it's institutions, it's the press, right? Doing what you do, which is poking and prodding and trying to figure out the truth and the facts of what's going on. So what is going to protect human rights in the Middle East more? Appeasing a terrorist state or trying to work with our partners in the Gulf and Saudi and Egypt? In fact, we should give the Biden administration credit here. They are working to advance a formalized relationship between Saudi and Israel. I think that's absolutely terrific. They are also working on a missile defense system with many nations in the Middle East. That's a great step forward, but you also have to ask, why is that happening? It's happening because these countries have no confidence in this administration to side with them. They see the continued, bowing and scraping to Tehran, and that worries them. And so they're trying to figure out how to create stability of their own. It's a very perilous time. And I think, I wish the president luck. I hope he has a great visit with MBS, but I think it'll be a tough meeting given how he's spoken of him in the past and also how he withdrew his support for MBS's efforts to fight the Iran-backed terrorists that are firing rockets at civilian centers in Saudi Arabia out of Yemen.
Mary Kissel, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And finally, is it inevitable that the human race will spread across the stars? And if so, will it be tech billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who gets us there? Martin Rees, Emeritus Professor of Cosmology and Astrophysics at Cambridge University, shares his thoughts in this week's issue. He joins me now. Martin Rees, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. To start with, I wondered if you could talk about the pictures published by NASA this week from the James Webb Telescope, because there's some amazing images coming out of this. But to the layman, it just looks like, pretty pictures. What are we actually seeing here?
Well, they put out 5 different pictures, and one of the most spectacular ones, indeed the first they put out, showed a tiny bit of sky, hugely magnified, as viewed through this telescope, which is a telescope in space with a mirror 21 feet across, which is far more powerful than any previous space telescope. And what it showed was a cluster of galaxies quite a long way away, and much further away, huge numbers of little smudges, which were actually galaxies so far away that the light from them has taken at least 90% of the time since the Big Bang to get to us. And another interesting feature which some people noticed was that some of the distant galaxies looked streaky. They looked as though they were a slightly crescent shape. And the reason for that is that the cluster of galaxies along the line of sight exerts a gravitational pull on the light and bends the light. And so it's like a lens. And so you're looking at these very, very distant galaxies through a sort of distorting lens, which is caused by the gravity of the cluster. And they purposely chose this particular patch of sky to look at because they knew it had a big cluster with lots of galaxies in, and also they might see this extra effect. So that's just the first picture. And by comparing this with pictures taken with the Hubble telescope, it's clear what a big factor improvement this new telescope is in terms of sensitivity to faint objects and also sharpness of resolution. And this was one of the 5 pictures they released yesterday. There was another one which I thought was not so spectacular, but is potentially interesting, which was something that told us about the light coming from a planet around another star. And everyone wants to know, is there life on other planets around other stars? And this is a first step towards a program to try and answer that question.
Amazing. And though this has been achieved by NASA, it does seem like the space agency has fallen in importance in the public imagination and in policy since, let's say, the height of the space race. You write in your piece, for example, in the 1960s, that NASA's budget was 4% of the US federal budget, and now it's less than 1%. Why do you think there has been this fall in importance?
Well, the reason why there's been that fall is that it was at this amazingly high level of up to 4% of the federal budget in the late 60s because of the Apollo program to beat the Russians to the moon. And this was not motivated by science or anything practical. It was just a political rivalry. And that, of course, did lead to the famous landing of Neil Armstrong on the moon in 1969. But having beaten the Russians to the moon, there was no motive to pursue that level of expenditure. I mean, I'm old enough to have remembered watching that picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon and the later astronauts in the following 2 years. And I and others thought at that time that there might be footprints on Mars after another 10 or 20 years. But of course, there haven't. In fact, after the last people returned from the moon in 1972, nobody, no human, has been further from Earth than in low Earth orbit, mainly in the space station. And this is really because there's no practical need to send people, especially now that robots are getting better.
Well, maybe that's something that will change as it looks like we're set to go into a Cold War with China in the next few decades. I mean, China's got its designs on the moon, it's got its Chang'e missions, and we already see a tech arms race between China and the US on things to do with technology on Earth. So I wonder if that space race, do you think it will restart?
Well, I think there may be a space race, perhaps to put facilities on the moon, but whether they will involve humans is not so clear to me. The Chinese might decide, for reasons of national pride, to send people to the moon, or they might even decide to send humans to Mars, because if they want to assert their parity with the US, it wouldn't be enough to do what the Americans had done 50 years earlier. So they might decide to do so for these reasons. But other than that, I don't think there's much case, because robots can now do the kind of things which humans were needed for in the past. And of course, if we're thinking about Mars, it's hugely more expensive to send humans and preserve them safely on a 200-day voyage than it is to send a robot that hibernates on the way and you needn't bring back. So my line in the article, and more generally, is that the case for humans is just as an adventure exploration, rather like the people who explored the southern hemisphere in the 17th century and the polar explorers, etc. And I think this should be left to private enterprise, because public funding in the US and in Europe has to be very risk averse. If you're sending civilians, then you've got to ensure they're safe. The public won't accept a high failure rate. For instance, the shuttle, which sent people up to the space station, was launched 135 times. And there were 2 failures, each of which killed a crew of 7. And those were traumatic events for the Americans because they'd been presented as safe tourism, as it were. But of course, a less than 2% failure rate, which is what that represents, is entirely acceptable to test pilots or adventurers. And so I think that we should leave this venture of human space flights to Messrs. Musk and Bezos and other sponsors, because they can launch thrill seekers prepared to accept high risks. And they will go to Mars. Perhaps some will have one-way tickets. In fact, Elon Musk himself has said he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he's 51 years old now, so 40 years from now, good luck to him.
Absolutely. Well, do you think that there is a risk in letting private entrepreneurs take the lead on this, insofar as let's entertain this sci-fi scenario where human race has colonized other planets, perhaps the moon. If we let the first mover be private individuals who are not elected to represent the human race, who are not representative in any way themselves because they're uber rich and have very idiosyncratic interests, can they be trusted to make that first move? There'll be lots of resources that they could tap into, give them incredible power. Isn't it better in the hands of governments for that to be happening?
Well, my cynical answer would be, can you trust the Americans? I think the more realistic answer is we're talking about just a few pioneers. And I think it's a dangerous delusion, which is held by Elon Musk in particular, that there will be millions of people who will want to go to Mars to escape the Earth's problems. That's a dangerous delusion because although it's hard to deal with climate change and all that, it's far harder to terraform Mars, to make it as habitable as the top of Everest or the ocean bed. And so I don't ever see there being mass migration. So I don't really worry about Mars being heavily populated and those sorts of issues arising. I think we need to worry about that for the moment. On the other hand, I do say in the article that I cheer these people on because they will be away from the regulators who on Earth are going quite rightly to regulate the use of cyborg and genetic technology to modify human beings. We don't want that to happen on the Earth, we're going to regulate it, but these guys on Mars, they'll be away from the clutches of the regulators. Moreover, they will have every incentive to adapt themselves because they're very poorly adapted to the gravity, the atmosphere and everything else on Mars. And so my scenario is that those crazy guys on Mars will pioneer what I'd call post-human evolution. They'll end up being a new species because they will evolve at a rate what I call secular intelligent design, which is much, much faster than Darwinian selection. And they'll be a different species and they may at some stage become purely electronic, in which case they might want to leave a planet and go off into the blue yonder. And if they're near immortal, then they won't be deterred by long interstellar voyages. So the far future could be dominated by those entities. And one thing which, as an astronomer, I'm probably more aware of than most people, is that we are nearer the beginning than the end of evolution. It's taken about 4 billion years to get from the first embryonic life on Earth to the biosphere of which we're a part. But the sun's less than halfway through its life. It's got 6 billion more years to go before it flares up and dies. And the wider cosmos may go on far longer. So in those thousands of, certainly millions or billions of years ahead, then we can imagine changes which will be at least as dramatic as the ones that have happened through Darwinian evolution. And so I think we've no idea what will happen on those vast time spans. But I think we can say that this century is rather special, which is the first century when one species on one planet, namely us here on Earth, can actually trigger these developments and perhaps a transition from flesh and blood to electronic entities.
Do you think that in those billions of years something like climate change wouldn't end the human race before then? In a sense that would prompt us to leave Earth en masse?
Well, I mean, I hope we can deal with climate change in the next 100 years. But I think even on Earth, I don't think humans will survive looking like humans for even 1 million years.
Wow.
And so life may have a longer future on Earth. But the point is that we are adapted by Darwinian selection to live on this Earth. And we cherish it and we admire it, it's beautiful, and we don't want to change it too fast. So I'd be in favor of regulation to limit the rate at which our Earth and our physique and our mentality can be changed by these new technologies, and hope we can preserve the Earth in the face of the obvious challenges, which are already concerning, as you know, because there are more of us on the Earth, all more demanding of energy resources, and all changing the climate in a way that hasn't happened in such a big way over any previous century.
Martin, I notice you say these entities when you're talking about these far in the distance and descendants of us. Do you think that they will still be human?
Well, no. I mean, I think, well, I think if we talk about the kind of evolution that's going to happen away from the Earth, on Mars or far beyond, they'll be as different from us as we are from slime mold, completely different. Because the time for evolution between us and them is as long as the time it's taken for us to evolve from slime mold. And moreover, future evolution will be faster, because that will happen on a technological timescale, which certainly is now, one would say, 50 years or so, whereas Darwinian evolution takes hundreds of thousands of years. So we've no idea what these entities would be in the far future.
It's very exciting times and very exciting to think about. And Martin, just finally, before I let you go, something else that we must talk about is if the human race is going to go into the galaxy even more, or even beyond, chances of encountering other intelligent life, perhaps? I mean, in those pictures from NASA this week, we saw that possibly there were some galaxies that held water or life, circumstances for life to develop. So, I mean, is that, do you think, an inevitability that we will meet other alien species?
Well, like I say, biology is a harder subject than astronomy, and so we can't make confident predictions about that. But it's one of the most important questions in science, of course, whether life was something which only originated because of some rare fluke on the Earth, or whether it's something which would have started on many environments like the Earth. And we now know that there are many such environments like the young Earth on planets orbiting other stars. And one reason why I'm excited about the James Webb Telescope is that I think it may well provide the first clues to whether there's any sort of vegetation or biosphere on any of those planets. And that would at least tell us that the origin of simple life was something that wasn't a rare fluke. As to the likelihood that that would develop into something intelligent, which we could recognize as such, that of course is even more uncertain. But I think it's worth looking. And I think if we look at the instruments that we'll have in the next 20 or 30 years, even more powerful than James Webb, bigger telescopes on the ground, which European scientists are building, for instance, these will be able to clarify whether there's any life. And of course, if there are aliens out there, then it's worth a search, and there are programs to look for evidence for anything that's a manifestly artificial type of artifact, or to look for any transmission that doesn't look natural, doesn't look to come from any kind of star, anything like that. And this is a search which is being pursued with some private support. In particular, a Russian-American investor called Yuri Milner is putting $10 million a year for 10 years into a program, and I chair his advisory board, and I'm very positive about this, which is simply going to use existing radio telescopes, put some special instruments on them so that they can be optimized to look for transmissions that have unusual properties, which might be an indicator of some sort of intelligence, or be relics of some intelligence which existed in the past.
Martin Rees, Lord Rees, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. This really puts the Tory leadership contest into context.
Right.
That's it for this week. Remember, if you enjoy what we do here at The Spectator, you can subscribe to the magazine and to our online content. Join today and you'll pay just £1 a week for unlimited online and app access in your first year. Go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer. And don't forget you can subscribe for free to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching and do join us next week.